Good to go? Okay, great. Welcome to today's panel, and hopefully you can all hear us. No microphone today, so this is going to be good. Okay. Responsible and ethical AI use for the enterprise. My name is Cristina Lawrence. I am the EVP of Consumer and Content Experience at Razorfish, which is a part of Publicis Group. If you know Publicis Group, it's one of the world's oldest and largest marketing communications agencies in the world. We have over 100,000 employees, spread amongst 100 different countries. And Razorfish is, I would say, one of the original digital agencies. A fun fact for you, we were founded about 30 years ago on the premise that anything that could be digital would be, and that's why we're all here today. And the fun fact is that we were the inventors of the first banner ad. So a lot has come to pass since then, because now we're talking about generative AI. Forget about banner ads, right? But anyway, and I'm here today with a wonderful group of folks. Over here to my left, I have Andrew Jenks. Andrew is the director of Provenance at Microsoft. He actually holds the original patent for media provenance, and he's the chair for the C2PA, or the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity. I have Ray Lansigan, who is also a part of Publicis Group, and he is the Publicis Digital Experience team's head of strategy, overseeing all of the digital agencies. And then last but not least, all the way over in the last seat is Qaiser Bachani. He is the head of consumer experience at Mondelēz International. And I don't know if either of you would like to just talk a little bit about your backgrounds and how it applies to what we're about to discuss today, or we can just jump into it.
Jump in.
Yeah, let's jump in. Okay. So today, just to frame up this discussion, we're going to be talking about responsible and ethical AI use, specifically focusing on generative AI. And ever since what happened in the fall of 22, really this is when generative AI really kind of burst onto the scene and became a part of the collective consciousness. And it really started to transform ever since then, rapidly transform the way that we communicate, the way that we approach marketing, the way that we create. And with great technological progress, there always is the potential for misuse. And in this case, and something we're going to focus on today, misinformation, copyright infringement, all the ways that actually this really amazing technology that feels magical can actually be used to create an alternate storyline for, I would say, culture at large, if not held to certain governance rules, and really be used responsibly. And so that's why there's really been a call within the industry to define standards around content provenance, which enables in our world where we're dealing with brands, especially brand safety. And so, let's just talk about current state. So Ray, when we talk about responsible AI in the enterprise, what do we actually mean when we say those marketing words? And why is it so important?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Cristina. So I kind of break it down into two things. The first is enterprise, and the second is trust. So if we think about enterprise, particularly from a private sector perspective, it's profit-generating entity. And I think the view of that, right, is what is the value proposition between the enterprise and the customer, the consumer, and how do you clarify that? Right, and the reason that that's important within the context of Gen AI is I think we talk a lot about Gen AI use cases and possibilities, which we will talk about in a little bit. But I like to say that AI is a tool and it's not a strategy, right? So from an enterprise perspective, clarifying what that value proposition is and how to connect with customers, consumers in order to drive value becomes really important. So that's kind of the enterprise front. On the trust piece, I think that's the other side, right? And it's about navigating risk. So when you think about trust, it's really about two parties trusting each other and figuring out how to mitigate the risk that exists in that uncertainty, right? So economists call this the trust game. You have to trust your counterparty in order to believe that they're going to fulfill on the promise that they made to you. right? It's very well covered in the economics literature. And it's the reason that we have things like contracts, the reason that we have things like laws, the reason that we have things like standards. And all of those are sort of signals of trust that help to mitigate the risk. So when we think about responsible use of AI in the enterprise context, for me, it's really about how the enterprise, the customer, the ecosystem in which it operates, ways that the enterprise can establish that trust in a world of synthetic media.
Awesome. And then Andrew, to that point, you solve trust for Microsoft. And so I think it's a two-part question. So how do you think about it within your own organization, but also while answering that, can you explain, I mean, really just to everyone, to just set the stage, what is, when we talk about content provenance, what exactly do we mean? And how is that different from things like content labeling or watermarking? And why is it so critically important? So there's a lot in that question.
Sure. So let's start at the beginning.
Yeah.
I'm not in charge of trust for Microsoft, just provenance. But I think when we talk about provenance and the issues surrounding trust, we often confuse trust and transparency, right? Trust flows from the user backwards. I decide who I trust, and it depends upon the context. I might trust my sister for medical information. In fact, I do. She's a nurse. I absolutely do not trust her for financial information, right? So that decision, that trust decision, is based not just upon the actor, but also the context. The only way that I can make sure that I'm making the right trust decision for myself is to have the transparency to know who I'm talking to and what we're talking about. And in a world of generative AI, of deep fakes, I lose some of that capability, right? We all do. And so how do we provide tools and technologies to reestablish that notion of transparency so that we can all make better trust decisions for ourselves? And that's not to say that anything that we're talking about means do trust this party, don't trust that party. I don't care who you trust. What I care is that if you've chosen to trust someone, you absolutely know that you are talking to them, right? That's what CTPA, that's what content credentials, that's what a lot of the tooling that we're going to talk about today brings you. That's particularly important in the context of brands, but it's important for all of us in our individual lives.
Awesome. And then Qaiser, knowing that, Mondelēz has really been a leader in using AI, and especially, just looking at some of the creative executions. So, for example, the Shah Rukh Khan My Ad, that I think just won at Cannes. Can you tell us a little bit about, what you're most proud of, and how did you get the overall organization comfortable with this new sort of technology and the use cases with it, especially within creative and marketing?
Sure. So let me try to answer your second question first, like how we did that. Listen, Mondelēz in itself is a relatively young organization. It's a 10-year-old company. Though our brands, which are more than 100 years into it, also Cadbury, Milka, Oreo, Toblerone, they all have huge legacies. But because we are still a relatively young company, it gives us that liberty to operate in a slightly different, more nimble way than maybe more established organizations. And I think that has helped us to go on this journey in a much more open mind, and not for the people who are practicing this entire topic, but also the senior stakeholders at the top, the C-suite level. And that's, to be honest, that's as simple as that. And every time there's new thing that has come, whether on the tech side or on the creative side, there has always been appetite to kind of test and learn, to see how things go and learn, rather than rather than being waiting for that. So that has kind of triggered us or kind of influenced us a lot. You mentioned about my Shah Rukh Khan ad. Yeah, it won Cannes twice, two in a row. There's more work happening right now, which I can't talk about it, but you will see very soon as well. A lot in Europe, a lot in the US. I think the work which I'm very proud of, because it was very simple, actually. My Shah Rukh Khan ad, great work, amazing strategy, amazing execution. But the work which is very close to my heart that we did in Greece, actually, earlier this year on Valentine's Day, where we have a very huge chocolate brand called Lecta in that market. and we partnered with ChatGPT to help people write Valentine messages for their loved ones, because it's a consumer insight, but it's very difficult at times to kind of find the right words for your
Right.
for your loved ones. And I think, going back to Andrew's point, it was a full disclosure that this is not
Right.
something that we are articulating it. It's a system that's generating it. If you want to trust that system, it's your call. But that's how. So it was full disclosure. This campaign was ran for 2 whole months, and the kind of feedback we received from the consumers and all the people was simply outstanding. It was a very simple campaign, just helping people voice their kind of words in a very creative way, and we partnered with ChatGPT. And there's many more work which is coming by Shah Rukh Khan. It's one of them. There's Cadbury birthday song activation in India, which is currently happening, where we have translated the English birthday song into thousands of Indian languages,
Right.
using the generative AI tech. Say It with Oreo is another campaign which is also taking place. So we are testing all these models right now, just to understand what is the sweet spot is. We still
Right.
haven't got it right. We still kind of gearing up or warming up to this idea that this is the new marketing reality. And the more we test these things, the more we do these things, we will learn a little bit more, which will help us to be much better in the future. And getting sponsorship on the C-suite level is incredible, because then you can run really fast
Yeah.
in this space.
And it sounds like the underpinning to all of it, though, is full transparency
Yes.
to the end user.
Yes.
Which I think marketing, if you're a marketing
That's what we do all
professional,
the time.
that's what we do,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
And so we only think in those terms.
Yes.
So I think that's really interesting. You're not approaching this in any other way than you would any other technology.
I think it's also got to do with the brands that you choose to operate in that space. So brands like Cadbury, brands like Oreo, they're established brands. They have already a trust
Right.
with the consumers. So that plays also in our favor in that kind of space as well, that you already have a brand equity to take this forward.
Yeah.
So,
And I'm dying to get into the risk portion, but hold on, we're still laying the groundwork. So, but building into, we're a kind of a second theme here as we're talking about the possibilities, and then back to you, Qaiser. Are you also seeing how generative AI is helping maybe Mondelēz do more faster? Are you seeing anything, discussions around increased speed and scale, or are there use cases
Yeah.
that you can cite?
See, I would say at this moment in time, 90% of the use cases are specific to efficiency and scale. Right? I think so. The work that we are doing, whether it's creative validation or creating digital creative and asset at scale, or even testing of some of our creative, that definitely is helping with this technology in place, because there's always ask from the business to do more with less, right? So this Gen AI or AI in general is helping in that area. So I would say 90% of the use cases are in that particular space. I think mid to long term, this will evolve. I really don't know how it will evolve and what kind of things we'll be able to kind of do with some of these tools. And as Ray said, it's a tool, not necessarily a strategy. But at the moment, yes, we are validating our creative at scale very quickly because of the tech. We are working with Publicis and our partners like WPP and BCCPs of the world to create asset at scale, which can be deployed pretty quickly as well, through which data with the loop, we can understand what's working, what's not working, but we can tweak and iterate and go back again to the market. And I think I think that will remain a key focus for the next short to mid-term, till we see a next iteration of AI or Gen AI, which then can help us to go a bit more differently. I think at this moment, the idea origination still remains with humans.
Yes.
And I don't know whether it will change or not. We can discuss about it definitely. So right now, the work which AI is doing is, to your point, is giving that efficiency, scale, speed pieces, and exactly that's how we are using it as well.
Right. Very cool. And then Andrew, so building on really what Qaiser was getting to, which is around speed and scale, and really what you can do from a content perspective. How do you feel that generative AI is going to create really that free flow of information, I would say, from a global perspective? For example, is it going to become like a super-powered extension of the internet itself? What do you think, where we're headed in that direction?
So I think generative AI becomes this super-powered extension of ourselves. Like, we can express things that we can never have expressed before. I cannot draw or paint to save my life. And tools like DALL-E allow me to become an artist and express what I'm thinking in a format that makes sense to me. It's, like you were saying, right, it's a tool, but it's a tool that helps us expand, much arguably like the internet helped us expand our memory, right?
Right.
We don't have to memorize everything anymore because it's all available at our fingertips and in our phones. I feel like generative AI is the same thing with our ability to express and our ability to get our points across.
Yeah, it becomes, for lack of a better word, it's a co-pilot.
Yeah.
Right.
That's a great word.
It's a great word.
Nice plug-in.
So Ray, how do you think that generative AI is creating a level playing field for, in this case, we're talking about talent?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think Qaiser, actually, both Qaiser and Andrew hit the nail on the head, right? You know, when you think about Gen AI as a tool, it expands all of our individual superpowers, right? So I can't draw either, I can't write music, but I do have ideas. And so the ability to execute my ideas or anyone's ideas becomes incredibly valuable. So you know, you could think of in our business, a media planner, for example, is generally someone who is planning and buying media on behalf of their brands, and they have to work cross-functionally with teams like creative or design or copywriting, search, etc. But AI helps diversify that skill set for them, and they're able to, you know, do more because they have that wider skill set. So, you know, if I abstract that back out to just sort of the world at large, I kind of think about the internet as democratizing information, whereas AI is democratizing outcomes. And so you might have ideas that come from places like Pakistan or the Philippines or remote areas in Africa, right, where the ability to execute those ideas hadn't existed for those individuals. I think Gen AI completely changes that. There's a lot of work we need to do around value pools and how all of the productivity associated with that gets distributed. But, you know, in the full expression of Gen AI, I think there's a very interesting conversation here about talent, about the decentralization of talent, and enabling outcomes that weren't previously available to individuals and populations.
And it's funny because as you're talking about how we're unlocking these possibilities, what that brings to mind then is the brand safety standards and measures that need to be put into place, because yes, we're unlocking them, but we're doing it on the behalf of clients, right? And especially from the point of view of a marketer, how are we ensuring that, you know, Qaiser, to what you were just speaking to, content at scale, now using these generative tools, how are we ensuring that we are, you know, creating kind of like that, the breadcrumbs of how this was created and with what, right, from a copyright perspective? Or how are we ensuring that we did not, you know, infringe on perhaps somebody else's idea, right? And in this case, it's, you know, who's to know what a model's been trained on, right? And so I just wanted to know, Ray, from your perspective, you know, what do you feel at this time are those necessary brand safety measures, knowing that there really aren't any at a global level, correct?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So I think I'll answer that question specifically, but just kind of taking a step back and couching it in the topic of this panel, right, which is responsible use of AI across the enterprise. What we're seeing from a marketing perspective is that it's not just about brand safety and brand moderation, things of that nature. The use of AI goes, it's far more existential into the organization, right? So it's things like how do you treat data? It's things like how do you ensure fair use and things of that nature, right? And what I'm finding very interesting in conversations with marketers is that they're bringing in other stakeholders around the organization that aren't typically part of our scope, right? It's the chief security officer, the chief digital officer, the chief legal officer, right? And so I think in order to have the conversation around brand safety and privacy, you have to solve sort of these first order questions that are the building blocks that permission the use of Gen AI. Specifically, though, as it relates to brand safety, I'll make the plug for content credentials, which is a standard that just recently launched in earnest a couple weeks ago out of work that Andrew and I do on the CGPA. And it's a way to expose the provenance of content. So you can see who has created it, and as the end user, you can choose how you're going to interact with that content and trust that content, right? Because from a brand advertiser perspective, I think you're generally concerned about two things. One is your content appearing, the brand safety issue, is it appearing next to other content on publishers that is in fact authentic? And on the other side, the brand safety issue, on the other side, the fair use issue, are your marks and is your content being used in appropriate ways by you or authorized derivative forms, as opposed to someone that might be hijacking a logo or other unauthorized use. But just to summarize all that, because it was a lot, I think it goes back to these enterprise-wide standards of how Gen AI is going to be used in the organization.
Yeah, and I also think, just to build on that, and knowing that being able to label and show provenance from a content perspective is so important. There's also, coupled with that, a bunch of topics that still have to be figured out from a legal perspective, such as anything that comes out of a model, who actually owns it? Like, that has not been settled. And so I know that for organizations like our own, when we're doing this work on the behalf of clients, you have to disclose to our client, you may not own this image that came out of this model for X, Y, and Z. That is something that I know that local courts are going to have to deal with over time, and we'll have more of those rules in place, but we're still in that period where it's a big gray area. So then to that point, Andrew, speaking of the role of legislation versus the private sector in really owning the governance of generative AI, who do you believe, and this might be, feel free to answer as you see fit, who should really lead and who should be following?
This is where I get myself in trouble. So I'm a huge believer in markets over mandates, right? And part of the reason that I believe that is that markets tend to move faster. I think just from a pragmatic standpoint, look, industry moves faster than government, but I think government has a huge role to play in generative AI and providing the safeguards. That's one of the reasons that the CGPA, as a 501(c), we can't lobby anyone, and we don't. But what we do is we educate everyone that we can get our hands on, right? Across the government, across the world, to explain to them, this is what the technology can do, this is what it can't do, this is how you should consider applying it to generative AI or other forms of media so that we can help establish that transparency. I think that's truly, truly important, is that industry has a role here, and that role is to help educate government so that they can regulate industry. It's this weird virtuous cycle. But I think from a purely pragmatic stance, industry is going to lead because it just moves faster.
And there's something else that when you were speaking that brought something up. So when we talk about transparency, how is it different now than in the past, where an example I use is like food stylists, okay?
Mhm.
A food stylist will make a beverage look gorgeous. The ice cubes that you see within that beverage, they are not real, right? But we have never been required to tell anyone that they're not real. So same thing with a burger or a sandwich, for that matter, that has gloss all over it or Vaseline to make it look, give it that perfect sheen. So why is it that we haven't been doing this all along? Like, why has it been, now that we have generative AI, all of a sudden we're obsessed with transparency when we actually haven't been doing it ever when it comes to things like, well, food styling?
I'm going to give somewhat of a heretical answer and
Okay,
say,
yeah.
look, there has always been misinformation, right? This is nothing new. We have tablets from the Romans with misinformation on them, right?
Yeah.
I'm not making that up. My mom was a Latin teacher. It's a weird anecdote. There's always been misinformation. What's happened now is the speed and the scale at which it's available forces us to kind of pay attention to these problems a little bit differently. When, in order to do food styling, I don't know, do food styling?
I think
Is that a thing?
I think you do food styling.
Okay. You know, your average consumer wasn't out there Vaselining up a burger to be able to make it look prettier. Now they can. They can do it with a few taps of their computer screen for $0, right? That scale opens up the capabilities and the technologies to far more people, which is fantastic, but that's also far more bad actors, right?
Yeah.
And so we have to worry about the malicious implications and malicious users of the technology more today, simply because there are going to be more of them.
And to that point, in the US, with the backdrop of the upcoming elections, which is always one of my favorite ways to think about all of this, and the historical cycles we've seen of tech acceleration before election seasons, right? How can organizations best navigate this without set regulations, without a set standards, really?
Yeah.
Because some would say that we're in a bit of a contentious time period at the moment.
A little bit, but I will say it's not just the US that we have to worry
Yes.
about this in, right? 85% of people that live in democracies are going to go to the polls over the next 18 months in the world. That's a huge number of people. And all of them are going to be confronted with issues like, how do you provide safe and secure democratic elections? How do you know that the information that purports to be from a candidate is actually from a candidate? How do you know that the things that you're seeing aren't generated? And for those counties that release things like ballot images, how do you know that those ballot images are actually authentic? Those are the kinds of questions that Microsoft and our Democracy Forward program in particular are grappling with on a daily basis, right? So that we can help not just US elections, but the UK elections, the Taiwanese elections, the Australian elections, everyone who's going to the polls. How do we generally ensure that our democratic processes continue to function in a world where we can make up anything we can dream of?
Right. Ray, do you have something? Oh, okay. And then to that end, so we did ask GPT-4 a question, because why not? So, you know, we asked, you know, the great AI machine what they thought was a watch out, and a question that they would like to ask the panel. And they said, what do you see as the most pressing ethical and societal challenges associated with these technologies? This is what GPT-4 would ask about itself. Open to any one of you. Or you can say we just talked about it all.
The question is, what are the most ethical...
What are the most pressing ethical and societal challenges associated with these technologies?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, I think there's a lot that we talked about, right? Um, I look at it as what is the intent of the information, and then transparency as a way to validate what the intent of information is, right? I think the ethical concern is that with the speed of digital content around the world and the amount of content that we all consume, that has a material impact on how we all behave. What we see in the ether, whether we are concentrating on it or passively consuming it, it impacts our beliefs, it impacts our behavior, right? And so I think the risk here is that content without transparency associated with it can be misinterpreted. That intention doesn't get attached to that, and bad actors can act in nefarious ways. So, for me, it's really about how do we solve that provenance issue.
Yeah.
I think I would just add, I think we spoke about it, and I think Andrew also touched upon it as well. I think it's the speed and scale. It's the biggest plus of AI or Gen AI or AI in general, and I think that will become the biggest threats as well. And through regulation, private sector, public sector, I think it's extremely critical to understand, to make sure that, of course, we give time and space and breathing space to the tech to evolve, but but at the same time, because it will be the component will be speed and scale, how we make sure that there is the right regulations and policies are in place, so it doesn't create a big challenge in the future. For me,
Right.
that's the could be the pressing issue.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
I'll be honest, the one that keeps me up at night is the liar's dividend, right? The idea that if some portion of the media that you're getting is falsified, what we as human beings tend to do is disbelieve everything that we see,
Yeah.
right? Generative AI, if unregulated, if unlabeled, if not transparent, can directly influence your relationship with reality. That's the thing that scares me more than anything.
That's a big one, because we're already starting to see some of those attitudes shift.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And then I would say that there's also a piece of this where we think about bias. And Qaiser, I'm wondering, AI bias, it's nothing new. It's been reported and talked about. But generative AI, there is the risk that it could compound existing biases, right? Really at an exponential scale, based on what we were just talking about, the ability to create content at unprecedented speed. And so how can enterprises, this is another one, as we think about those rules for governance, how do we keep track of that?
I think that there are two parts to it. And one is, first you probably need to understand in terms of what's what sort of source on which models have been developed, right? I think majority of the models that I was talking about, majority of the work that we are doing are looking at our content libraries from the past.
Right.
Right. So that kind of minimizes that sort of an issue at the moment. But yes, in the future, as the tools evolve and as we would like to see part original and part kind of previous work, how it's going to create or have an influence on the on that particular topic is something could be scary and something that we need to kind of address. I think at the same time, I think Ray touched upon it a little bit earlier, is eventually it's a enterprise conversation. It's not that marketing only owns this conversation, only legal owns this conversation. I think all these parties needs to come together, have to create frameworks, so that if tomorrow we are either creating something completely original or something which we are adapting, should have those kind of basic criteria in place, so that nothing goes out without any kind of controls and checks. Even as of today, when we are, whether it's a Shah Rukh Khan ad or a Lecta Grease example or Oreo birthday song, all these are being, there is a, you may argue we have created a bit of a bureaucratic layer, but the process goes through 5-6 different checks. and only like eventually it has to be signed off from a very senior person before it goes on.
So it's humans at every step of the
exactly,
process.
Exactly. So
Right.
again, I don't think so it's efficient, but it's needed. Let me put it this way. And I think let's see how it evolves in the future. I think everybody is looking forward to that time when this thing will become even much more efficient. And if we start creating newer ideas with it as well, then what kind of intervention we need is going to be human or part human, part machine. I think that's yet to be seen. But even as of today, right now, we do have guardrails and human checking before something goes out.
And I think that's just a critical part of the process, and for everybody to understand is humans are still incredibly valuable. Humans are going nowhere when it comes to making sure that anything that goes out the door, it needs to be verified 5 times over. Right? Yeah.
Nobody knows what's going to happen in the future, but yeah, I think in short to mid-term, humans are not going anywhere.
Right. So. Yeah. And then, relate to that, so then let's talk about then the future. So, as we look ahead, how can enterprise leaders educate and really evangelize responsible AI best practices in their organizations? What does that look like?
Listen, I think organizations like Mondelēz or Microsoft or Publicis going on, they live and breathe trainings and making sure that people are absolutely have all the latest understanding of the topics, how things are evolving. Similar to other topics, whether it's creative thinking, whether it's problem solving, whether it is programmatic, whether it is creative excellence, we have a robust capability program already in place, and currently we are working with our partners, WPP, Publicis, Accenture, to help develop new modules for us so that we can go and educate not only the marketing community, but the entire enterprise in this newer topics and newer areas. Of course, not everybody needs to know how ChatGPT works, but should have a basic understanding, okay, this is what it is, pros and cons, and how should we look into that. So I think we are going to do the same thing. We are already doing that kind of work with our partners to establish those modules so we can go and train all our entire community, our entire enterprise on these topics from basic to advanced levels, similar to what we have done in the past. And that's one of the beauty of these companies. They really pay a lot of attention and effort and value in capability building of the people on these topics. And this is another critical topic that we are addressing right now.
Right. And then Ray, so what can leaders of agencies like our own, or of partners, that we work with, even like an Adobe or whomever, or Microsoft, who is also represented right here next to me on this panel, do to instill greater confidence in the safety of these Gen AI tools among the clients and the enterprise partners that we work with?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it's a good summation of everything that we've been talking about. And infrastructure is an idea that we've always talked about from a technology perspective. You can certainly talk about it from an engineering perspective, but I think now evolving the infrastructure term to be inclusive of transparency and trust is really what should be on the tip of the tongue of every CEO for the next 24 months. And that pervades all aspects of enterprise interactions with their own employees, with customers, with suppliers, with everything in their ecosystem, right? And so part of that is data privacy and how data is treated. Part of that is prompt engineering and where that lives and is tracked within an organization. Part of that is production, right? And ensuring the tools that are in the production chain are all verified for, all of the issues that we talked about here. And then part of that is also provenance, right? So I think those are 4 building blocks that fall under this trust infrastructure that becomes important for enterprises to really think about in earnest. I think a handful, 3 of us here represent marketing and advertising. That's one component, right? But there's many other aspects of the enterprise, all aspects of the enterprise that are going to be affected by Gen AI. And all of those executives, lines of business, et cetera, all those functions, I think, need their own version of this trust infrastructure.
And I would say to Andrew, and why this trust infrastructure is so critical. I just think that we're at this moment in time where there are all of these things that are happening within society. So generative AI has really kind of given rise to the question of copyright and copyright infringement. But meanwhile, there are these subtle changes that are happening elsewhere. For example, content created by humans versus AI, and how we label that has been changing, right? There are social platforms, which I will not name, but for example, recently decided that the real identity of a user is no longer needs to be verified, and now they're allowing fake accounts. Well, not fake accounts, but accounts under alternate names, for example. So like we're losing grip of perhaps what I would say provenance in terms of a person, right? Meanwhile, there's this tool, generative AI, that allows you to create in limitless ways whatever you should see fit. So I just think all of this intersecting right at this moment in time is very interesting. So my question to you then is, what do you believe are the overall implications if we keep going down this road with no governance in place?
I want to say I think this could go one of two ways, but that's not true. Look, it's going to go both ways. There's going to be positives and there's going to be negatives from the technology and the tool, depending upon how it's used. It's no different than a chainsaw. I can do great things with the chainsaw and I can do great harm with the chainsaw, right? The application of it is what matters. The application of generative AI is what matters. And at the end of the day, it's us, it's enterprises, it's individuals who are going to be applying that. And so I think the results that we see will actually be a reflection of the citizenry and the populace and how we're thinking. And if we're thinking and feeling nice to each other, generative AI is not going to be that big a deal. And if we're not, if we're malicious actors, if we want to cause great harm, suddenly we have to worry a lot more about the guardrails and make sure that the tools and technologies are there. I tend not to believe that every human being is going to be a nice person, so I think we actually need those guardrails. But I do think that the results we'll see will be a reflection of ourselves in a lot of ways.
And do you think that, in knowing that we largely live in a culture where we do receive, much of the news we receive is through a news feed? Mm-hmm. And when you scroll fast and you're looking at that feed. Mm-hmm. So do you think, though, that there is a time where we will be able to create a unified standard where the curious among us will want to know what is the content that they're reading? Where did it come from? It's making an assumption that an everyday person is going to want to go 2 or 3 clicks deep.
Yeah, and look, everybody's not going to want to. And everybody's not going to want to go 1 click deep, right? But I absolutely believe that there will be a standard, and that I haven't wasted the last 4 years of my life trying to create one. But I absolutely believe there will be a standard, and I believe that for the 60 to 80% of people who want to know where their information is coming from, they will be able to obtain that. Now, we're never going to get 100% of people. My grandfather is going to keep clicking share on every video that he sees, no matter what it is.
It's
right?
It's like the way of the world.
It is absolutely.
Yeah.
What we're looking for here is herd immunity to slow the viral spread of mis and disinformation.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah. Okay, so then we asked GPT-4. I'm going to just end with a question from, OpenAI, GPT-4. Okay. They answered, considering the evolving landscape of generative AI, what strategies or framework should be adopted to ensure its responsible and inclusive development and deployment in the coming decade? So it limited itself to the next decade, which I thought was interesting. But and it put in there to ensure its responsible and inclusive development and deployment in the coming decade.
It's a good, I'll start. I mean, it's a great question. One thing that we didn't talk about here very much is stakeholder capitalism and how that's going to evolve, right? So to whom are the value of generative AI going to accrue? And in the world that Andrew was describing, positive outcomes and negative outcomes, if we believe in markets and the efficiency of markets, and there's a fair and equitable distribution of value that is associated with generative AI, I think we're more likely to have better actors and good actors rather than bad actors, right? Bad actors can act out of commercial intent and commercial gain. They can, that's a large part of bad actors. Ideological, of course, but ultimately, I think there's an interesting market component here, and for the enterprise and sort of polities at large to think through how value is distributed across the system. To me, that's a big framework that we need to think about.
I think with every tech advancement or any advance of the last century, I think one question we should always be asking whether this will be a net positive or a net negative for the society. I'm confident that AI or Gen AI will be a net positive, and there will always be bad actors, as Andrew and Ray has said. Even when printing press was invented, there were some bad actors, there were good actors as well. So I think it all depends how you use the tool to your advantage. And I think the important thing, I think this time around could be, is I think we don't have to only look at inwards to create benchmarks and rules and regulation. Whether even if it's a private sector, I think it has to be more of a horizontal approach where the sharing of this should be the regulation, or this should be the guardrails, and this is how we are looking at it, or there's an issue that we found out here. I think there needs to be much more openness and sharing within the private sector as well.
Yes.
In that space compared to in the past. But I still, and the question is whether how we are going to manage the bias or inclusivity, etc. I think if there's more intent toward having that conversation more at a horizontal level, I think we will see a net positive from this tool or this tech in the future.
Yeah. And I think we're probably, to be end on a positive note, because I think we're right on time and we can ask questions. I think we're starting right at the beginning of seeing the widespread adoption of this tech, whereas I think like with social, for example, we were trying to retrofit ideas and even governance onto something that had already, it was like the cat was out of the bag, right? And it was already, fully, enmeshed in daily life. So maybe we're ahead of it, maybe, right? And then to that note, so unless any of you have anything else to add, I think we're right on time and we can ask questions. Yeah? And are there questions?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm usually quite loud, so I don't mind needing a microphone necessarily.
The online audience.
Oh, fine. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Oh, that's a very small microphone. My name is James Pinnell. I actually work more in the fields of democracy, so I was really glad to see elections come up. And also really interesting the discussions around transparency, but also the idea that the layperson has limited bandwidth to take on information. I think that's definitely the case. And actually the discussion prior to this one downstairs said that a lot of consumers of these outputs will say, just tell me if I can trust this or not. That's all I need. Well, possibly you need more than that. And maybe this question is more to Andrew than to anyone, but would love to hear from everyone. This idea of what does the standard need to be in terms of transparency, do you think that standard should be guided at all or predominantly by what consumers say they need? Or do you think actually industry and enterprise needs to lead in saying, well, no, actually, you don't really know what you don't know, so let us give you as much information as we think you need. I'm just curious where you think that standard needs to be driven from in that sense.
I don't think it's an either or question. I think it's a both question. I think that we as industry sat down and said, we think what consumers need is this. One of the most frustrating things to do in the world is UX testing for a new technology, right? You put it in front of consumers who have never seen it before, and they show you all the ways that what you've done is horribly wrong. And I think it was Laura downstairs, one of the UX researchers from Adobe, who was making that point, right? That's the process that we're in right now, is gathering feedback and finding out what we think, what consumers think they actually need and what they think of what we have given them, because we've probably gotten it wrong. There's probably more stuff for us to add or take away. I'll tell you one area that goes directly to what you're talking about. Tell me whether or not I should believe this, is the notion of reputation management, right? The standard is absolutely silent on that today, but without that, without a notion of who is this person and should I trust them? Do people that I trust them? What does the web of trust look like? We have to figure out a way to reflect that in the standard as well, so that people can get the information necessary to make good trust decisions when they're confronted by, say, first-person information from a country that they know almost nothing about a major news item taking place. So there's at least one area I think we have to grow, but I think it's both. We're going to throw some spaghetti against the wall. Some of it's going to stick, some of it's not.
And doesn't that speak to, you bring up reputation, so I go back to things like the preservation of journalistic standards, right? And so it starts really, I would think, with journalistic standards and the media outlets that really that have represented unbiased opinion, or, well, not opinion, unbiased facts, truth and reporting. I think that is like, I think that's a place to start, perhaps. I mean, I would love your opinion on that.
I think it's a place to start, but I don't think that bias necessarily means you should not have access to transparency,
Yes.
right? Like, I think, like I was saying earlier, trust is a personal decision, and whoever you choose to trust, you should know that that's who you're hearing from, right? And so I don't think of this as I do think there's a huge role for journalistic standards to play in defense of democracy and other things. The actual technology, I think, is removed from that. I think it's really cool to look at tools like NewsGuard, for example, and say, how can that utilize the nutrition label for news and add nutrition label for provenance into it? I think those are some of the questions that we're going to be grappling with going forward.
That's great. Any other questions?
I suppose I have a question then. Thank you so much for the talk. My name is Ellen, and I'm a student of this Oxford Internet Institute. So my background is actually psychology and education studies. So I'm quite curious to know that in a current age of the generative AI tools kind of booming in this current age, how would you explain the ethics of AI to young people, particularly the Generation Z, who lived through the age of technology development and also the largest population of AI technology users, I would say, in the current age?
That's a big question. I mean, it's fitting that we're having the conversation here at Oxford, because I think part of the answer to that is critical thinking, right? And, you know, if there's a theme that's going across here, it's about being able to think critically about the information that we all consume, where it comes from, the biases or any other factors that influence those sources of information. And I think institutions like these around the world are critical in sort of forming those critical thinking skills for Gen Z, right? And for me, that's the crux of it. We can't relinquish human agency in terms of human choice, right? If we do that, we run into a really bad place. So I think it's really about building this muscle of critical thinking and practicing it in all aspects of our lives.
And beyond that, I think you're asking a question about media literacy, right? We have to get
100%.
better at teaching media literacy. And this is something where the Content Authenticity Initiative released some material on this. Microsoft is doing some other stuff on this, but like, look, we know that the best way to teach parents and grandparents to be better consumers of media is to teach the kids. It's what we did with the SSL lock icon, right? We got the information into schools. They went home. They explained to their parents why they should stop putting their credit cards on non-SSL
100%.
sites.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To build on that. So I have a 6-year-old going to turn 7, and I've already started, whether or not I really was thinking about it it was media literacy, but I've already started teaching her about what an ad is. The ads that come up while she's playing one of her favorite iPad games, right? And why, by the way, she's getting ads, I'm not quite sure, because we put the parental controls on, but that's a whole other story. But like, I have a 6-year-old that understands what an advertisement is, and that, because I've talked to her about it, and that this is trying to sell you something, or it's trying to persuade you to like something, right? Or tell you that you might need something that you do not need. And so she right now is like this evangelist within her 1st grade, where she's walking around telling everybody what an ad is, right? Like, she knows advertisements. And I think it begins there, frankly. So I don't know, I think we should be teaching the youngest among us. I mean, as soon as they start looking at anything digital, a phone or a screen, we need to be teaching them what they're looking at. It will find them, so.
Great question.
Yeah.
All right. Oh, we have one more.
Hi, can you hear me? Yes, you can. This just follows up on the last response about critical thinking. I happen to agree 100% with you, but we're speaking very much from a liberal, democratic, Western perspective. How do you see us broaching the different approaches to critical thinking across the globe if we're ever going to be able to come together, collaborate with other jurisdictions when it comes to global standards in this regard? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a hard question. It's a fantastically difficult question. I don't know. That's one of the things that we're grappling with now, right? As we know how to solve it for Western-leaning democratic countries. I don't know how to solve it for authoritarian regimes.
I think there is probably some encouraging information, though, in the sense that the internet has democratized access to information. So as we see younger generations that are growing up in other places around the world, the culture among Gen Z and Gen Alpha has actually converged a bit, right? And you think about channels like YouTube or TikTok, and you can go to countries around the world, and those kids have a very shared passion for those sources of entertainment. And so I think part of it is the issue of making sure that information pervades across borders, across different regimes, to be able to build up that cultural fluency and unity, regardless of border. So that's encouraging, but for places that don't enable free press, or that don't enable those platforms, that is definitely a challenge that we need to solve.
But one of the interesting things, and this, I'm going to reference the talk last session downstairs again. Grant asked a question about what happens in China and Russia.
Yeah.
China and Russia are super interested in the work that we're doing in the CTPA because they want their official news stations to be authoritative, just like CBC or NBC.
Right.
Right, so that's fascinating, yeah.
Yeah, so I think we will see it cross borders. I think the question is, how do we interact with it?
Yeah. So I think we're at time. Well, I'd like to thank all of you for attending, and I'd like to thank all of the panelists.